From yesterday to return to live coverage of a discussion on intelligent design. This began this morning. It's being hosted by the American Enterprise Institute. The luncheon speaker this afternoon is Lawrence Krauss. He is the chair of the physics department at Case Western Reserve University.
Case Western Reserve University. He also directs two centers at Case Western, the Center for Education and Research in Cosmology and Astrophysics, and the Office of Science, Public Policy, and Biotechnology in the School of Medicine. He's a prolific author. His seventh popular book, Hiding in the Mirror, The Mysterious Allure of Extra Dimensions from Plato to String Theory and Beyond, actually came out today. So, fortuitous timing. Perhaps more than any other subject, Dr. Krauss has devoted himself to examining the intersection of science and public policy and defending the teaching of science in public schools. He has been involved in the debate in the Ohio schools, which along with Kansas and Dover has been the focus of controversy over the issue of intelligent design. And he's been actively involved in the national level with articles in the New York Times and elsewhere. Actually, in some ways, helping to touch off the debate earlier this year, with a piece in the Times, and also involving himself in the controversy over the Catholic Church's apparent reversal of their position on the separation of evolution and science. I welcome Dr. Krauss.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. If I stand and talk, does this work? Can you hear me? If I stand and talk, do I have to sit? Does this work? I guess I have to get close. Okay, I'll sit. I can use a podium, but then I can't see the people over there. So I like this better. Okay, well, so I was asked to talk in some sense about public policy issues. I'm going to try, I had to anticipate what my friends and colleagues would say this morning, and I'm going to try not to repeat much of it. Some of it is inevitable based on what I've already heard from when I arrived. So the title of my talk is Facing Reality, Public Policy, Science Education, and the Emperor's New Clothes. And I want to talk about the public policy issues associated with this social controversy of whether one should teach intelligent design in classrooms. And since we're at the American Enterprise Institute, I thought I would start with the wealth of nations and point out that part of the social controversy, I was amused when a friend of mine just arrived back from England, where of course Darwin is on the 10-pound note. And in the United States, we have this weird thing, and maybe that's the source of some of the public policy problems we have here. I'm not sure, but when we talk about public policy, this is a real issue, and I will quote President Bush on this, who said most recently, and it touched off a storm of newspaper reports, that both, referring to intelligent design and evolution, he said both sides ought to be properly taught so people can understand what the debate is about. That itself is not an unreasonable statement. What it does represent, of course, is a misunderstanding of the issue, and it reaches all the way to the White House, and therefore it's not surprising that that we are here and that I have to go around the country often and talk about this when I would rather be talking about how interesting science is. I want to talk about the context of this, and the context of this current debate is that it's happening in a society in which scientific ignorance pervades almost every aspect of our society, and I'll try and present some data that makes that clear, although we've heard some arguments that make that clear, at least since I've been here. But one thing that's been in the news recently is clearly that our public schools are not effectively teaching science. And a recent example was that U.S. 12th graders performed well below the international average for 21 countries in math and science, and there's tons of statistics like that. To compare us to other societies with whom we are ultimately competing in the 21st century, 66% of undergraduates go into science and engineering in Japan, 59% into science and engineering in China, 32% in the United States. Okay? So all these things, I think, reflect or are useful to try and understand the context of this current supposed controversy. The National Academy of Science has gotten worried about this and recently published a set of proposals which, again, have received a lot of attention in the press, suggesting that funds be set aside to create 10,000 new qualified science teachers each year, because we desperately need them in this country, and to strengthen the math and science skills of an additional 250,000 teachers using new after-school programs for the teachers. We are when we talk about the teaching of intelligent design, we have to remember it's in the context of a school system that is largely broken in terms of mathematics and science, where the teachers have a very difficult time teaching evolution as it is, even because most of them don't have a background in science at all. And as they said at the end of their proposals, without a renewed effort to bolster the foundations of our competitiveness, we can expect to lose our privileged position. And I think that's the context that we have to understand all of this in, because really we're spending an inordinate amount of time debating what many of us think is a non-issue, when instead of what we should be doing, which is trying to improve science education in the classrooms. What we desperately need to do if this country is to remain competitive and to maintain the quality of living that we now have. And that's really what I want to do to underscore my presentation, that as a policy issue, what we really have to worry about is improving science quality and not getting sidetracked any more than okay, I won't. I was going to say something else, but maybe I shouldn't here. Well, no, any more than it was a good use of the Congress's time to come back and regarding Terri Schiavo, which, when there's incredible problems in the country, to get sidetracked on a side issue like that is very similar in my mind to getting sidetracked in this issue. Now, there's a sociological context that I want to talk about as well. Science is not; these are not good times for scientists. Science, and as someone who goes around trying to make an effort to improve people's understanding of science, it's clear to me. And in fact, in Europe, where I think there's much less distrust of science, even there, a recent survey found that the number of people who felt the benefits of science outweigh the risks dropped. And so people are distrustful of science, and that's of some concern. Now, to get a sense of where we're at, I like to pick out figures at random, and here are some figures that I picked out that should depress you. The fraction of school children believing in astrology rose from 40% to 59% between 1978 and 84. That's the last time I could find data. That, of course, given Michael Behe's recent statement that intelligent design is like astrology, as far as on a comparable par, would suggest that maybe we should be teaching astrology in the schools. But here's more damaging and more worrisome data. Then every year, the National Science Foundation does a survey of scientific literacy. And it takes a few years to compile the data, and undoubtedly the 2002 data is out. I haven't gotten it yet. The 2001 data I have. And here are some examples. So in that survey, 53% of American adults were unaware that the last dinosaur died before the first human arose. Okay, maybe that's not too surprising. The next one always amazes me. 50% of American adults knew that the Earth orbits the sun and takes a year to do it. Okay, 50%. Now, when I first saw that, I thought that was a trick question. So I went to the survey, and the survey said, the Earth orbits the sun and takes a year to do it. True or false? Okay? And every year since they've done that survey, every single year since they've done that survey, half of the American public gets it wrong. Okay? And this was also viewed to be a great landmark, because it was the first time in the history of that survey that more than 50% of American adults claimed to know that human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. So the first time over 50%. It was a short-lived blip, of course. And in fact, there are many surveys, and I'll show you some more that are even worse than what you heard quoted earlier. This is one, for example, that 45% of American adults surveyed in November 2004 stated their belief that God created humans in their present form less than 10,000 years ago. 45% of American adults. So this is the context, the scientific understanding that this whole debate is being carried out on a social basis. At the same time, I have to say that, and I know there are journalists here, and I have great respect for journalists, let me say that right off. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that among the general journalistic community, there's a great hesitancy on scientific matters to make pronouncements. And I think any scientist who's been interviewed and talks to journalists recognize that. There are issues behind that, and one could go into them. I know that many journalists have told me if it were not for a physics class, at some point they would be doing something else. But I think the key point, there's a fundamental tension in the reporting of science that's important here. And that is that journalism is generally based on the notion that there are always two sides to every story. And every time I'm involved in a scientific story, usually the journalists try and find other people to at least provide a balance, because that's the way journalism is done. But the thing that makes it difficult to cover science is often, very often, there's only one side. what I mean by that is often one side is simply wrong. And that, in fact, is what makes science unique and wonderful. Because you can unambiguously talk about what's wrong. The biggest misunderstanding about science in the general public, in my opinion, is people think science tells us what's true. Science doesn't do that. It tells us what's false. That's all science can do, is falsify things. And you falsify things, and hopefully, like Sherlock Holmes, if you keep falsifying stuff, then the stuff that isn't falsified probably has some remnant of truth in it. But it's not a literary criticism question or an opinion or a belief. Something is wrong if it doesn't agree with the data. That's it. End of story. It doesn't matter how beautiful it is, how elegant it is, how wonderful it is, it's wrong. Okay? And that makes science, that's why we have progress. Because we can get rid of unproductive ideas. At the same time, it's important to realize that the whole scientific issue is being politicized, and I want to just point out some changes in the last decade. Here's a quotation which is a wonderful quote given by President of the United States to the National Academy of Sciences. Science, like any field of endeavor, relies on freedom of inquiry, and one of the hallmarks of that freedom is objectivity. Now more than ever, on issues ranging from climate change to AIDS research to genetic engineering to food additives, government relies on the impartial perspective of science for guidance. That is a good statement about science, and it was made by President George H.W. Bush to the National Academy of Sciences a little over a decade ago, about 15 years ago now. Now that has to be compared with what we're hearing about science in the political arena now, and this was a statement from the current administration, for example. This administration looks at the facts and reviews the best available science based on what's right for the American people. Now there's a difference in those two statements. And that political context again, is important to recognize. When we talk about this, there are a lot of issues, not just intelligent design, where science and politics are coming into conflict. And in fact, we've seen religion and science colliding in lots of different places, and a place where it's happened politically again, in the political arena, is a quote from former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay, who himself, by the way, has a degree in biology, who made the famous statement introduced in the Congressional Record that the Columbine shootings occurred in part, quote, because our school systems teach our children that they're nothing but glorified apes who have evolutionized out of some primordial mud. That's the general political context in which this debate is occurring. Now, we've seen a lot of discussions about intelligent design. I want to gloss over this because I know you've talked about it. But the point is it has a lot of different definitions, and there's a reason why it has a lot of different definitions, because, in fact, I would argue it hasn't been subjected to the same kind of peer review and scrutiny that say, Darwinian evolution has. It's got many different definitions, but I think what we have seen, and what is most important to understand about this, is that intelligent design is primarily opposed to evolution. And Barbara, I think, alluded to that. That is the one unifying theme, I think, between most of the different people that are discussing intelligent design in different contexts. And I think it's important to talk about why that is. And I will get to that. Okay? That's a real question. Why are people opposed to evolution? And is the opposition scientific? The key opposition, and I think John Calvert really demonstrated that the real opposition is not so much to evolution as to science itself, science as is traditionally carried out by scientists. That is the concern, that somehow science is not only non-theistic, according to John and others, but basically immoral for that reason. And when in Ohio, for example, when there was a debate about science standards, which I'll talk about in a few while, which I got heavily involved with, there was a group that was produced called Science Excellence for All Ohioans, which was an interesting organization associated with James Dobson. And they said science standards use a little-known rule to censor the evidence of design. In fact, as John said, the rule, which is usually unstated, is often referred to as methodological naturalism. Now, as Barbara pointed out, we have another name for it in the scientific community. We call it the scientific method. And basically, the key thing to realize is that this is really primarily not an attack on evolution. Evolution hits home because it's personal, it's about us as human beings. But the broader question is, what is science all about? And that is what many people find offensive, that science is based on the scientific method. And as I'll talk about in a moment, it still amazes me that even if you're offended by that the way you go out and try and change that is in the high schools. But we'll get to that. There is, Barbara alluded to the wedge strategy, and many of you have heard of this, but this was a document, and it was associated with the Center for what was then called the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. That was a too emotionally charged term for the Discovery Institute, so the renewal has been removed. But this is an important statement. This is a group that primarily says we are only interested in the science and evolution is scientifically suspect. But what does the document say? It says the proposition that human beings are created in the image of God is one of the bedrock principles on which Western civilization was built. This cardinal idea came under wholesale attack, drawing on the discoveries of modern science. Science is the villain. Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture seeks nothing less than the overthrow of materialism and its cultural legacies. Science is bad. Now, there's been a campaign, and there really has been a very effective campaign. In fact, the public relations campaign, the public relations battle has certainly been won by the Discovery Institute, I would argue. And in fact, it's very interesting to see that campaign and how well orchestrated it is. The governing goals that were described in 1998 were to defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies. Again, not just that scientific materialism is flawed philosophically, but it's bad morally, culturally, and politically. And to replace materialistic explanations with the theistic understanding that nature and human beings are created by God. That's the a priori goal of a group that, I remind you, says, well, we find flaws in evolution scientifically. And among the 5-year goals, well, this one is an interesting one. I haven't seen it yet, but this one I find particularly interesting. To begin attacking science teaching in the public schools. In 2002 and 2003 in Ohio, that's exactly what began to happen in a very concerted, effective way. Now, I want to talk a little bit, as I was asked to, about the Ohio experience, because it's interesting. And we're going to hear from people who are much more expert in law than I about the legal history of the battle of evolution. And I want to just remind you of the recent developments that are important here. And that was the very important McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education federal court ruling that creation science is in fact religion, which was reaffirmed by the very important Supreme Court decision in 1987. But as you know, a dissenting opinion by someone who was not the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now, Scalia, raised the idea of evidence against evolution, which is perfectly reasonable. It's perfectly appropriate to talk about evidence against evolution if there is such evidence. Okay? But that then became the rallying cry for a concerted effort to take away from, instead of trying to teach creation science, to teach that evolution is suspect. Because that is what the court sort of motivated. In 2002, the Ohio Board of Education began developing a new science curriculum. A huge debate began to occur and promoted by a variety of well-supported and well-funded groups to include intelligent design in that debate. And in fact, Professor Miller and I were part of a debate in Columbus with 2 members of the Discovery Institute on that very issue. It was, I believe, at that debate was the first time that this term came out, I think. Stephen Meyer, everyone had expected to argue that intelligent design should be taught in the classroom, made a beautiful public relations move. He said, you know what? We don't want to argue that anymore. We want to compromise. We just want to teach the controversy. It's a compromise. And that sounds eminently reasonable. It's a brilliant move because, of course, it suggests that A, it's a compromise, and B, that there's a controversy. It presumes both of those things, and in fact, that attack was very effective in Ohio, and I think we've seen it's very effective nationally, and that's why it's continually being used, as if it's a compromise. Now, the compromise resulted in the following in the Ohio Board of Education standards. First of all, it was a great success. After great effort, for the first time in 70 years, the word evolution was introduced in the state science standards in Ohio, due to a lot of effort of a number of scientists at least. So that's a great success. But the following words were attached to the science standards, which on their own sound innocuous. They suggested that students learn how scientists continue to investigate and critically analyze aspects of evolutionary theory. What could be wrong with that? Well, a number of us at the time argued that that was completely inappropriate. Why? Because that sentence should in fact appear at the beginning of the science standards, and it should say, students should learn how scientists are continuing to investigate and critically examine every scientific theory. Because that's how science is done. But by singling out evolution, it makes it appear suspect. People said, no, that won't happen. Well, what happened? In 2004, the Board of Education Curriculum Committee, which developed a curriculum based on the science standards that was passed, in fact did exactly what we said would happen. Instead of producing a lesson plan that suggested that students learn how scientists are continuing to investigate and critically analyze aspects of evolutionary theory, they produced a lesson plan that was critical of evolutionary theory. And in fact, the lesson plan was full of factual errors, and in fact the only major references were in fact to the religious literature on the web. A group of scientists produced a lesson plan, in fact, that talked about the real controversies that are happening in biology and said, you should teach this. And in fact, it was so bad that we got the president of the National Academy of Sciences to write a letter saying, this is an abysmally bad bit of science. Well, the lesson plan was passed in Ohio. One of the reasons it was passed, and again, this is the context in which we're dealing, is that I tried to understand why they did not listen to the president of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences letter on this. And I learned that at that time the president of the Ohio State School Board informed me that, well, that she'd never heard of the National Academy of Sciences. Okay, thought it was a lobbying group, and therefore ignored that group. Okay? Now, that effectively produced a little wedge in the state of Ohio. Okay? Now, what was said by the people who were trying to effectively use a strategy, state by state, to build this apparent suspect nature of evolution into state science standards? Well, Stephen Meyer immediately said that, of course, the state science standards were now a victory for the principle of teaching the controversy, in spite of the fact that in the science standards it specifically said that in no way should this be construed as any support for teaching, for example, intelligent design in the classroom. Philip Johnson, who always has much better quotes, said, Ohio is not a minor state. Kansas is a marginal state, not one the Eastern establishment pays much attention to. Ohio's decision is a victory in the battle to free science classes from the grip of Charles Darwin. So that's how we see that what happens with a small wedge gets in fact turned into an apparent controversy. Now, well, yeah, let's go back. I want to address the questions that I think policymakers in different states should ask about whether intelligent design should be taught. And first of all, one of the questions is the philosophical rationales for that. And Barbara just left, she's a philosopher. But I believe when you look at the rationales for attack that John has mentioned and others, they come down to some interesting philosophical questions, or at least ones that one can ask. Is science without God incomplete? That's a question one can certainly ask. Is science without God immoral? Okay. Philosophically, is there evidence for design? Those are all interesting philosophical questions, I would concede. But even if you concede that those are interesting philosophical questions and are viable, in no way do they justify changing science high school teaching. We don't decide how, the key point here is that we don't decide how science is done in the high school science classroom. That's where students learn how it's done. If we want to talk about how science is done, it's done in the scientific community, in the scholarly community. And if you really believe these questions, then you should be going out and doing research to explore those questions, convince the community, and eventually get in the classroom. There's certainly, as I say, perfectly valid questions, and I encourage people who believe in any of these things or who think any of these things are worthy to talk about, to explore them and convince their colleagues of these issues. But to suggest that just because these are interesting philosophical questions that we should change the teaching of genetics in high school science classes is just, to me, absurd. Now, when presented, as policymakers will be in each state where the science standards are coming up with, there's a strategy to try and get this introduced, and we've seen it here a variety of times. One is, and these strategies are very effective. First of all, that all we'd want to do is have an open mind. Let's just have an open mind. Why should we decide in advance what's right and wrong? Let's be honest. Let's be honest about the fact that a lot of people believe in intelligent design. Or in something even more extreme. And let's be fair, and I think that's the thing that's really hit the scientific community, or the popular public the most, because you appeal to American fairness. The idea that it's only fair, after all, to have both sides, and we heard that eloquently, reasonably eloquently, presented by John Calvert. Now, I think, on the other hand, what policymakers should see, and this is really important, is that it's exactly the opposite. Is that the issue is that, in fact, the whole presentation is closed-minded. We've seen that. I have a lot of evidence I could present, but I think that we've seen that in the data from the Wedge document. That the presumption is that science without God is, in some sense, immoral, and therefore, evolution must be wrong because it doesn't explicitly mention God. That is the ultimate in closed-mindedness. The way science works, and the reason I love science so much, and the reason I think every young person should have the experience of having something they profoundly, deeply believe to be true, to be shown to be false. There's nothing more liberating than that. And there's nothing that any scientist wants to do. People have this X-Files view of science, that scientists are this cadre of people that get together and have this handshake, and we want to keep the truth away. We know what's right, and we want everyone to believe that. Well, the point is, there's nothing that any scientist would want to do more than prove his or her colleagues wrong. That is why we do science. Okay? And, yeah, okay, it doesn't matter. So, the point is, open-mindedness is forcing, ultimately, what you believe to be true to be affected by the evidence of the world around you. It is not requiring the world around you to conform to what you believe to be true a priori, which is exactly what we've heard and seen in things like the Wedge document. So it's closed-minded. It's absolutely dishonest because it presumes that there is a scientific controversy, and we've heard it talked about again. I'm going to give you some different data on this, and there isn't. And it really is ultimately unfair, as I'll try and show you. So I've talked about the first one. Let's talk about this controversy. Here's some data. A colleague of mine did a survey of over 10 million articles in over 20 major science journals during the past 12 years. Hit the keyword evolution. 115,000 articles use the keyword evolution. Most of them refer to biological evolution. Hit the keyword intelligent design. 88 articles. All but 11 of these were in engineering journals, however, where one hopes there is, in fact, intelligent design. Okay? Of the remaining 11, it turns out the articles, 8 of them were in fact critical of the scientific basis of intelligent design, and the remaining 3, it turned out, were not in peer-reviewed research journals. They were in conference proceedings. Now, so, there's no controversy in the scientific literature. Now, when I talk about this, people who disagree with it will point out that it is very difficult to get things published in the scientific literature, and the scientific community is supposedly closed-minded, and we keep out things that we disagree with. To those people, I first say, however, the first thing I say is I defy any of them to demonstrate that they've had more articles rejected from scientific journals than I have. Okay? And no one has ever proved that to me yet. The second thing, however, is they say, well, look, because we can't do this, we go the old-fashioned way. We produce books. After all, Darwin produced a book, Origin of the Species. They don't point out he also produced a paper for the Royal Society, which was a presentation. So they said, we produce books. So I decided after hearing that to go to another location. I went to Amazon.com a week ago. I hit the keyword evolution. Found 21,822 books appearing with the keyword evolution. I didn't do a systematic survey. I looked through, most of them were about biological evolution. I hit the keyword intelligent design. Got 635 hits. I looked at them. About half of them are again in engineering journals, intelligent design and materials research, etc. Half of them were critical of intelligent design, leaving about 150 books, and it turns out articles. Amazon.com now has articles in there. 150 books and articles left over on intelligent design. Just for fun, I hit the keyword alien abduction. Okay? I hit 106, which is another thing I sometimes debate with people, by the way, with my Star Trek hat on. But I found 165 books on alien abduction. So even if you don't talk about the scientific literature, if you talk about the unpeer-reviewed book marketing realm, this is as abundant as an idea as alien abduction. And if we're going to teach one, we might want to teach the other. Okay? Now, the reason it's unfair, and I borrowed this slide from my friend Ken Miller, is it is ultimately unfair because here is how science is done. First, you have an idea. There's design. Okay? Novel idea. Then you actually do research. Now, that research can be experimental or theoretical. And then after you do the research, you submit it for publication, and it gets sent out to people who are idiots. Okay? They're called peer reviewers. Okay? And those idiots tell you why you're wrong. And then you write to them explaining how ridiculous they are. And you debate, and it takes a long time, and sometimes you get it published. But big deal, you get it published. There's a lot of junk that's published. If it's a good idea, then other scientists start to think about it, and they start to do experiments or theoretical research based on it, and ultimately, after a long time, it might build scientific consensus. And then 20 or 30 years later, it may make it into the classroom high school textbooks. In my own field of physics, if you look at high school textbooks, they're easily 30 to 40 years out of date. Why? Because that's how long it takes to trickle down there. Okay? Now, what do the intelligent design community want to do? They just want to get rid of the intermediate steps. Okay? That, they want to go directly from the idea to the classroom. Forget all that pesky intermediate stuff, doing the research, peer review, all that, consensus. And that is ultimately unfair, because if you want to pretend you're doing science, you got to perform on the same playing field as the rest of the people. And that is why this is ultimately unfair. Okay? Now, another reason it's unfair is the fact, as was pointed out at least once today, I think, that we don't have a lot of time. And a high school teacher in New Mexico pointed out, I need it spelled out that I don't have to address a string of silly alternative theories. I have 175 classroom days. That's not much time to teach biology, and I don't have time. Now, but it's also important to realize that science just isn't fair. Like it or not, science is ultimately unfair. That's what makes it so great. Not all ideas are treated equally. I again remind you that certain ideas which don't satisfy empirical testing go by the wayside, and that is truly the greatest legacy. We don't say, this is a beautiful idea, this is a beautiful idea, and I had it and I find it very elegant, as some of my string theory colleagues would say, and I would say, well, that's fine, but it doesn't explain anything. Okay? And that is why science works. Ideas are not treated equally. Now, another public policy issue, and a really viable one, I think, is the claim, a priori, is the claim that at least 50% of the US populace doesn't believe in evolution, so aren't we doing a disservice not to introduce it in the classroom, that debate into the classroom? Now let me give you some data, some figures which are more depressing than any of you heard from the most recent Harris poll. So okay, here's one that's not too surprising. Do you believe human beings developed from earlier species or not? 54% said no, 38% said yes. By far a bigger plurality than in the presidential election. They say they don't believe in evolution. But that's not as depressing as these other ones. Which of the following do you believe about how humans came to be? Only 22% believe that human beings evolved from earlier species. 64% believe they were created directly by God, and about 10% believe in intelligent design. Okay? But the thing that I find most depressing is the following. Regardless of what you may personally believe, which of these do you believe should be taught in public schools? 12% only said evolution only. Twice as many said creationism only. And then only 4%, by the way, said intelligent design only. And 55% said, why not teach all three? So if that's the case, why not teach all three? Well, the point is, we should first of all remember a piece of data I gave you earlier. In that NSF survey, and this alludes to the question that was brought earlier, 50% of adults knew that the Earth orbits the Sun and takes a year to do it. 50% of the American public, therefore, does not know that the Sun is essentially the center of the solar system. So as was pointed out in that question earlier, but even more strongly, not just a few marginal people, but 50% of the American public doesn't know this. So if that's the case, should we not teach Earth-centric cosmology and physics classes? After all, 50% of the public thinks that the Earth is the center of the solar system. Obviously not, and the reason is really quite simple. The purpose of education is not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it. And if 54% of the people don't know that humans came from earlier species of animals, it doesn't mean we should validate that. It means we have to do a better job of teaching biology in the classroom. Just the same as the fact that we have to do a better job of teaching astronomy and physics. What these data represent is not democracy in action, but rather the fact that we are doing a rotten job of teaching science. And the fact that people are scientifically illiterate is no motivation for us to just simply give in. We just have to do a better job. Now, this point was raised for policymakers. There are PhD scientists who question evolution, and this question of lists was brought up a number of times. And the point is, you can find PhD scientists that will say absolutely anything. The great thing that is not recognized about science, again, is that there are no scientific authorities. That's an anathema to science authority. There are scientific experts, and even they can be wrong. They're not authorities. A graduate student can disagree and be right. And I absolutely agree with John Calvert that that statement of the 48 Nobel laureates, by the way, was a stupid statement. Nobel laureates can be wrong. I have a lot of friends who are Nobel laureates, and I can verify they're wrong a lot. Okay? Now, as far as these lists are concerned, here's one of many advertisements that were given to show that there's 100 PhD scientists in that particular poll that didn't believe in Darwinism. To point out the silliness of this, the National Center for Science Education produced a program which I called Bringing in the Steves, but we got, they and I helped them get statements from 500 scientists named Steve, including every Nobel laureate named Steve, who supported evolution, to point out that basically getting 100 scientists to say anything doesn't prove anything. And having a PhD doesn't make you a scientist. It means you have a PhD. And you can't use that. Now, another argument that's used for public policy is the argument that, and it was said out here, that after all, this does encourage critical thinking. Why not introduce intelligent design in a biology classroom, after all, and then discuss why, as a straw man, why it has its flaws, etc. Won't students learn something? Well, undeniably they will learn something. I think that's true. But why introduce a straw man? Why not talk about real scientific controversies? If you really are interested in critical thinking, produce real controversies that you can talk to students about. In my own field of physics, the nature of gravity, there's a lot more scientific papers saying that Newton's wrong than there are saying Darwin's wrong. Okay, that's a controversy. Why is gravity under attack? Quantum mechanics, basis of modern physics. I have a friend of mine, again, who's a Nobel laureate, who thinks at a fundamental level quantum mechanics is wrong. And I think it's in some ways developing into a minor controversy. In biology, why not talk about natural selection, random mutation, and the issue of how they interact? And there are controversies from people who believe in the relevant significance of those things. Those are real controversies. They're not fake ones. And if you want students to learn about controversies in science, talk about the controversies that actually exist. That is much more effective critical thinking. Okay? Now, I want to hit the last question. I think the last thing I probably want to talk about is this question of historical science. It has been pointed out, as we've heard today, that somehow evolution is a historical science. Well, in fact, here's a wonderful, John Bacon, who is a Kansas State Board member, you probably know him, John, said, I can't understand what they're squealing about. Millions or billions of years ago, I wasn't here and neither were they. Okay? That policy issue, in fact, of course, doesn't totally misrepresent science. Unlike, in fact, another scientist that you quoted that I completely disagree with, there is no such thing as historical science, or rather, all science is historical science. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences said it this way in a document. They said, this misses the point about how science tests hypotheses. We don't see the Earth going around the sun or atoms that make up matter. We see their consequences. Scientists infer that atoms exist and the Earth revolves because they've tested predictions derived from these concepts by extensive observation and experimentation. All science is historical science. Every science. Physics is historical science. We base physics on experiments that have been performed in the past or observations that have been made in the past. But that doesn't make them historical, purely, because the whole point of what makes them science is that you then predict the future. And evolutionary biology is exactly like other sciences in that sense. We make observations that are past, but we then make predictions about observations that have not yet been made. We predict the future. Or experiments that have not yet been performed about genetic resemblances and susceptibility to viruses among different species. These are experiments that aren't been performed. We make predictions about them. We test them. And when they agree, that's the science. And that's how evolutionary biology has survived for the last 150 years. So all historical science predicts the future. If it was just storytelling, it wouldn't be science. Okay? And in fact, let me just point out, we do it. You know, I'm an astrophysicist. I study, among other things, the sun. That's a nice picture of the sun. It's historical science. Okay? When I look at the sun, does anyone know how long it takes from the light that's emitted by the sun coming to you today? Does anyone know how long it takes for that light, from the time the energy was emitted, other than George, and from the light that's emitted, or other than George, from the center of the sun, when the energy is released in the nuclear reactions in the center of the sun, by the time it takes to get to the outside? Do you have an idea?
I told them this morning.
Okay, I just heard her say 8 minutes. It's a million years. It's 1 million years. It takes light 8 minutes to get from the surface of the sun to us, but to get from the center of the sun to the outside of the sun, it's a random walk that takes 1 million years. We're doing historical science whenever we look at the sun, and we infer from what we see about the structure of the sun, and it's historical, but you know that what we then do is we then measure the structure of the sun by using seismology, and in fact we can measure and our predictions about the density profile of the sun agree exactly with observations. That's historical science.
Is it 1 million years and 8 minutes?
Well, the 8 minutes is at the end. It's 1 million years plus or minus a bit. The next question is whether there is evidence for design, and if there is, shouldn't we discuss it? Well, evidence for design is an interesting philosophical question, and it's a very subtle one. Is there evidence for design in nature, in science, in biology? Here are two beautifully apparently designed objects. Okay, what they are snowflakes, right? They look like Christmas ornaments. But if you had to pick something that looked like it would be designed, it would be that. Of course, we understand how these random laws of physics and chemistry produce crystal structures that produce snowflakes. Okay? But a priori, if you want to look at that and didn't know yet how the laws of physics and chemistry did it, you'd say it was evidence for design. What about clear evidence for design, like human structures, like Buckminster Fuller's beautiful geodesic domes? Clear evidence for design, unless it happens to be nature producing Buckminster Fullerene, carbon-60, which is naturally produced in soot, and we understand how it's produced, and it's a vitally important, becoming, in many cases, a vitally important tool for modern technology. Again, evidence for design. In this case, we understand how attractions between molecules can produce a structure that looks identical to the Buckminster Fuller structure. I'm sure that Ken talked about evidence against design. I won't go into it. The point is there's a lot of evidence against design. Probably the strongest one is that almost all species that have ever appeared now are extinct, which says if the design was there, maybe it wasn't such good design. But I think that debate is aside. The key point I want to point out is that really science is independent of these questions of purpose. I'm on the second last slide if you're trying to get up. Okay. Science is independent of these questions of purpose. That science does not deal with purpose and design. In fact, one of the things that wasn't said in John's statement is that evolution isn't about the origin of life, it's about the origin of species. We don't know how life evolved. And in fact, if you look at Darwin's book, he says life evolved because God made the first species. That's what he says in The Origin of the Species. But what we try to discuss in evolutionary biology is how the diversity of life on Earth arose now. It's totally different than the origin of life. But the key example, in fact, I want to use is the example that I used in my piece in the New York Times that caused such a stir with the cardinal. Is Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest. Okay? He was the first person to actually show that Einstein's equations produced a Big Bang. Einstein didn't believe it, and Einstein derided him for it, by the way, until he was proved to be wrong. When he did that, Pope Pius made a statement that science had proved Genesis. Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, wrote to the Pope and said, "Stop saying that. This is a scientific theory that makes predictions. The metaphysical or religious implications are aside from the theory. You can take it to mean that you believe it proves the existence of God. You can also take it to mean that there's no need for the existence of God. That is aside from the theory." And the same, just as that's true for the Big Bang Theory, it's precisely true for evolution. It's independent of your theistic or non-theistic beliefs. There are devoutly religious biologists like my friend Ken over here. There are devoutly atheistic biologists like Richard Dawkins. Doesn't matter. They both do evolutionary biology. And Jeannie said it well. She said the First Amendment protects against the government establishment of religion, but that doesn't mean it will protect against bad science. The only way we can protect against bad science is all of us affecting policy. This issue, why should we care? And I'm adding this last thing because you asked me to say it, John, so that's why I'm saying it. Why should we scientists get upset about some statement that people are being required to read in a Dover court, after all? I mean, a Dover classroom. Should we just ignore it? I mean, it's just a little bit of fluff. And the point is, it isn't. Because it's untrue. And the minute we allow truth to be blurred in one area of schooling or the public policy, it is a slippery slope. And I personally don't care much at all about the fact that this may violate the separation of church and state. What I care about is we're forcing teachers to lie. And forcing teachers to lie is not a good thing. We are not censoring them, as John said. No one is saying that teachers should not be allowed to talk about intelligent design. What we're talking about is, should it be mandated that teachers are required to talk about this? And clearly in a science classroom the answer is no. As far as I'm concerned, if they want to bring up this debate as an interesting thing and aside, it's fine. In a history class, if they want to bring up the fact that some people don't believe in the Holocaust, I wouldn't do it, but if they want to, that's their prerogative. But they shouldn't be mandated to do that. And that's what we're talking about, whether they should be mandated to talk about things that aren't science in a science classroom. And therefore, let me end by saying the universe is a remarkable place without all the junk. And I believe only when we're willing to accept the universe for what it is without fear will we be able to build a just society. Science is not a threat to a moral world. The scientific ethos involves things like honesty, open-mindedness, creativity, egalitarianism, and full disclosure, things that all, if they were in the public arena right now, would make the world a better place. And the bottom line is it works. And that's why we should be teaching it for our students. We should be teaching it for our students because in lots of areas nowadays we need the students to know about science if they're going to contribute to a technological society. We owe it to them because science works to teach them about science. And as the National Academy said, I repeat, since this is the American Enterprise Institute, without a renewed effort to bolster the foundations of our competitiveness, we can expect to lose our privileged position. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was very, very interesting. I'm sure that it stimulated a lot of thinking among people in the audience here who have questions for Dr. Krause. And I welcome some questions that people may have.
How can anyone have any questions?
We have the microphones way in the back. The gentleman, if you could just wait till the microphone comes. And by the way, I know that some people over in this section have not maybe been shy about asking questions because they thought they couldn't be seen, but I'll make an effort to look over there if you have some questions.
Thanks. My name is Danny Horowitz. From someone who agrees basically with everything you've said, it seems to me there's a big question of how do you communicate with people who, it seems to me, you have some who are cynically opposing some of this. Basically you have people who are driven by fear that their basic view of the universe, all of their moral underpinnings and so forth, are threatened. And even hearing a talk like yours would probably make them feel threatened because it seems sort of glib. How do we reach out to those people and make them believe that this really is not a threat to them?
It's a very good question, and it's a real problem. And you're absolutely right. My presentation here was slightly different than it would be, as it is when I've gone into fundamentalist colleges and talked about that. And you're absolutely right, I believe, that this is driven by fear. And the fear, I don't think, is completely misplaced. I think one has to be honest about it. As my friend Steve Weinberg, who's a physicist and notably anti-religious, has said, science does not make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. And that's really important, because until you had science, everything was miraculous. And so science is, for some people, a threat. And I think what one has to do, and I could have given a different lecture here, and I have the slides, but I'm sure John won't want me to do it, and the most effective I think I've ever been is going into fundamental schools and pointing out, using quotes by Moses Maimonides and St. Augustine and the Pope, that you don't have to be an atheist to believe in religion, in evolution. You don't have to be an atheist. In fact, all of these people say precisely the opposite. And I have found when I've gone into those schools that kids have come up to me and said, this is a shock because every week in my church or wherever I've been told that all my life. And to see theological authorities talk about that and point out that intelligent design is not just bad science, it's bad theology, is important. And I think we have to do that. And you really hit the point. Scientists, we have lost the public relation battle in many ways, and I didn't go into it. Scientists are particularly bad at public relations in many ways. But one thing we have to do is become evangelists. Because people who are trying to attack science are evangelists. And that means not talking just to forums like this or going to high schools even, but going to churches. And going out and pointing out that that science is not a threat to your beliefs. And in fact, if you feel it is, you're ultimately going to result in problems. And if you, and so the issue you've raised is very important, I believe. There was someone over there. I can't see them because the cameraman, but...
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Peter McMahon. I'm an economist.
Is
I
your
learned
microphone
a little
on?
bit. Can you hear?
I can hear you.
I learned a little while ago that Ken Miller and I were in the same class at Brown, which means we were both beneficiaries of what I suspect was the greatest impetus towards science and math education, which is Sputnik.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe we were fighting godless communism, but what do you see? Is there something on the horizon that will replicate the effects of, being outclassed by the Russians? We need, another math revolution, another science revolution, and I don't see what's going to bring us there.
Well, that's a good question. Of course, if I knew what it could be, I would be involved in trying to do it. But I think actually I alluded to it, and I chose that example specifically because of where we're at right now. Ultimately, I think the reasons will be economic. The wake-up call that it is vitally important to recognize that we are, as a society, where we are today because of fundamental research in science. Not even applied research, fundamental research. Playing around with quantum mechanics led to transistors, which affected everything. And it is necessary for us, especially in this 21st century world, to be competitive, to have our children trained in science and competent and able to compete around the world stage. And I think, ultimately, that was what happened. I put Kansas up there. Kansas, by the way, when the first time they removed evolution from the state science curriculum, who opposed it? The Republican governor of Kansas. Why? Because it was bad for business. Why? Because big companies didn't want to move to Kansas if it had a backward high school system. And so I think, there may be a crisis, and there may be global warming, and maybe some other, it may be the realization that science could have saved New Orleans. It could be lots of things. But I ultimately think that economics is going to power the reason for trying, I hope, to improve science education in this country. And if you look at the National Academy of Sciences report, it was really precisely around that issue.
That gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Jim Goodyear. I had wanted to ask this of all the other people who
but I get to answer.
Because the first time I've been called on, I've been back here. Somebody got called twice, but here I am, all pro and con. All of you have spoken of intelligent design versus evolution. Don't you realize that intelligent design is a method of explaining evolution and therefore denying creationism?
Well,
Lamarck created evolution, and he had a method of explaining it. It has been falsified. Darwin explained evolution.
Look, I think the issue was whether intelligent design should be taught in the classroom, and not. And I do not think this is, and I will not appear in such form would suggest that there is at this point a viable scientific debate between intelligent design and evolution. But the key point is, I should have the quote, which I have later on from the beginning of Origin of the Species, where Darwin says, "Into the first forms God breathed life, and from there." And I'm paraphrasing, but as the laws of physics make the world, gravity make the world go round, so too have natural laws resulted in this beautiful diversity. So if you want, yeah, sure, Darwin believed in intelligent design. Doesn't matter. The issue here is teaching about what we know about the origin of the diversity of species on Earth, their interrelationships, and making predictions that are relevant for curing diseases, for understanding where we came from, and for dealing with the fact that we live in an ecosystem here on Earth that we have to ultimately survive in. And those are the questions. And so it's never been a discussion of intelligent design versus evolution. It's trying to understand how we got here, not why we got here, but how we got here. And that's all science deals with. And scientists are often really belligerent, and often we get into trouble because we're so snooty about this. We tend to think that science is everything, and Richard Dawkins is an example of that. I think it isn't. It's very limited, and that's the other thing we have to teach our students is what science isn't. And if something isn't falsifiable, it isn't science. And science only deals with the how; it doesn't deal with the why. If you want to talk about the why, that's fine, but it's not science.
Is there anyone back in that?
There's someone I see. Oh,
No. Yes. This will be the last question before we break for the afternoon.
I'm interested in this red state, blue state phenomenon where you have increasing division in America, not only politically, but in what people believe, in whether they go to church or they don't go to church. Can you envisage an America in which on either coast evolution is taught, and in the vast red middle of the country they have a different education system which actually kind of intensifies the divisions that are already here?
Well, yeah, I can envisage that. I can envisage lots of awful things. And I think that we are in danger of that or worse. I can envisage a place where the coasts don't teach evolution either. And I think it's precisely because of envisaging those things that I spend my time here and at other places like this, because it is important. I believe that science is important for our society, and that I believe, I'm an educator, and there's that old statement that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay? To me, it's all based on education, and all I want to do is teach kids about how the world works, because I think it's incredible. And if they learn that, the world will be a better place. And so when I envisage a world where students are somehow lied to or material is censored in any form, I object to that, because it's not only an anathema to science to misinform and restrict information. I believe it's the greatest threat to democracy. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.